Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history from Roanoke County, Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The autumn of 1874 in Roanoke Valley was unusually cold. A biting chill settled over the rolling hills and forest-covered mountains, seeping into the wooden frames of homesteads scattered across the countryside. It was the kind of cold that made people hurry through their tasks, that kept conversations brief and purposeful. But for those who lived in the house at the end of Blackwood Pike, the silence came from something deeper than the weather. The property belonged to Ezekiel Browder, a widower of 64 years, descendant of one of the area's founding families. The house stood apart from neighboring structures with its imposing presence, featuring a wide front porch supported by columns of classical design, tall windows protected by wrought iron grills, and a once magnificent garden that, according to neighbors, had been vibrant in earlier times. Now, however, weeds overtook the abandoned flower beds, and ivy climbed the peeling walls, creating shadows that seemed to shift in the twilight. County records from that era describe the residence as having been built in 1839 by Thaddeus Browder, father of Ezekiel, during the prosperous years following the regional railroad expansion. The architecture blended European elements brought back from Thaddeus's travels to England and Scotland, with adaptations suited to the Virginia climate. According to documents of the period, the house occupied approximately 2 acres of land and had 2 main floors plus an attic and an extensive basement that, curiously, took up only half the total area of the construction. It was common for passers-by to quicken their stride when walking past the residence, particularly after sunset. There was no specific reason for this, at least not one that could be clearly articulated. It was more a feeling, a subtle discomfort, as if the house observed those who passed by it. Interviews conducted by historian Nathaniel Pierce in 1958 with elderly residents of the region reveal that even before Ezekiel Browder's disappearance, the house had developed a peculiar reputation. Martha Caldwell, a washerwoman who worked for several wealthy families in the area, reported, "That house was always different. Even when Mr. Ezekiel was in better health, there was something strange there. The clothes I washed for him always had an odor. Not common dirt, but something like damp earth and dried herbs, even on the clean items. And Mr. Browder always handed me the laundry personally, never allowing me beyond the service entrance." The official story, the one that appeared in county records, was straightforward. Ezekiel Browder lived alone after the death of his wife, Adelaide Browder, which occurred in 1861. Without heirs, he dedicated himself to managing the assets left by his late father and was rarely seen in town. His public appearances were limited to Sunday services at St. Mary's Episcopal Church, always dressed in black, always seated in the same pew, always alone. The details surrounding Adelaide Browder's death, though apparently well documented, present intriguing inconsistencies. According to the official death certificate, signed by Dr. Ambrose Whitfield on February 17, 1861, the cause of death was recorded as cardiac arrest resulting from consumption. However, a more detailed medical report, found in the archives of the old Roanoke Memorial Hospital, describes symptoms that hardly correspond to consumption. The patient presents periods of extreme agitation, alternating with profound lethargy. She reports disturbing visions and insists there is something within the walls that watches her. The pupils remain dilated even under strong light, and the skin exhibits an abnormal pallor. Most disturbing is the fact that during episodes of delirium, she occasionally speaks in a language unknown to this physician. On November 12, 1874, Ezekiel Browder did not appear at church service. Initially, no one gave much importance to this fact. Elderly individuals occasionally fall ill or simply decide to stay home. But when his absence extended to 3 consecutive Sundays, Reverend Jeremiah Winthrop decided to send his housekeeper, Prudence Miller, to check on the widower's well-being. Reverend Winthrop was not a man who easily intruded on the affairs of his parishioners, especially those belonging to the county's established families. According to his personal diaries kept in the diocesan library, he held a peculiar respect for Ezekiel Browder, mixed with something that could be described as apprehension. In an entry dated October 1872, he writes, "Today I heard Mr. E. Bihar's confession. As always, his confessions are formal and restrained, almost rehearsed. However, today I noticed something different in his eyes, a feverish gleam that does not match his usual composure. When I inquired about his health, he replied only that the nights have been long. At the end, he asked me something unusual. He wanted to know if I believed that the dead could return not by divine will, but by the power of an earthly promise. I answered with Scripture, naturally, but the question troubled me for the rest of the day." What Prudence found, or more precisely, what she did not find, would begin a series of events that would profoundly mark the memory of the county, even if, with the passing years, many preferred to forget. As stated in the police report dated December 7, 1874, filed at the Roanoke County Sheriff's Office and subsequently transferred to the State Historical Archive, Prudence knocked at the door of the house at the end of Blackwood Pike for many minutes without receiving a response. Noting that the door was not locked, merely closed, the housekeeper decided to enter, calling out Ezekiel's name. The interior of the house was impeccably clean and organized, as if it had been prepared to receive visitors. In the sitting room, on a side table, there was a half-empty cup of tea, long cold. No sign of struggle or disorder, no sign of Ezekiel Browder. The police report, written by Clerk Josiah Harmon under the dictation of Sheriff Wallace Montgomery, describes the scene with an almost clinical objectivity, but includes a curious detail. The housekeeper reports that upon entering the residence, she noticed that all the clocks in the house were stopped exactly at 3:17, including the wall clock in the parlor, the pocket watch on the desk in the study, and even the small clock in the master bedroom. Mrs. Miller states that this detail caused her particular discomfort, though she could not explain why. Prudence explored all the rooms of the house, parlor, kitchen, 4 bedrooms, study, without finding the owner. As she later reported to the police, it was in the basement that she noticed something unusual. An old chest made of dark wood, the kind used to store clothes or mementos, was open, something uncommon considering that Ezekiel Browder was known to keep all his belongings carefully stored and locked. The basement of the residence deserves a more detailed description, as its unusual configuration would later become an object of interest for investigators of the case. Unlike typical basements of colonial houses of the time, generally simple storage spaces with packed earth floors, the basement of the Browder house had been constructed with evident attention to detail. The floor was of cut stone. The walls lined with a type of mortar which, according to specialists consulted years later, contained unusual components that made it exceptionally resistant to moisture. Illumination was provided by small barred windows at ground level, positioned in such a way that, even on overcast days, the space received sufficient light. Most curious, however, was the division of the space. Although the house occupied a considerable area, the accessible basement corresponded to only about half of this area. The other half, according to architectural plans of the time, would simply be compacted earth. However, the wall that separated the 2 sections was not aligned with any wall of the upper house, creating an asymmetrical layout that intrigued architects who later studied the case. More intriguing still was the small dark wooden door, almost imperceptible, installed in the dividing wall, always kept locked by Ezekiel Browder. Inside the chest, Prudence found only a black-covered notebook, apparently a diary. Flipping through it quickly, she noticed that the pages were filled with elegant and precise handwriting, undoubtedly that of Ezekiel Browder. However, something caught her attention. In the last written pages, the handwriting became progressively more tremulous, almost illegible, as if it had been recorded by someone under extreme stress or fear. The housekeeper took the notebook with her and went directly to the sheriff's office, where she reported the widower's disappearance to Sheriff Montgomery. Sheriff Wallace Montgomery was not known for his investigative zeal. At 52 years old, he occupied the position more due to his political connections than professional competence. A former militia captain of intermediate rank, he had been appointed sheriff in 1868 after supporting the winning faction in a local electoral dispute. His record of solved cases was mediocre, especially when they involved influential families of the region. A journalist of the time, Cyrus Pemberton, described him in a column as a man who prefers the comfort of his chair to the inconvenience of truth. The official investigation into the disappearance of Ezekiel Browder was superficial and brief. After 3 days of searching the property and surroundings without finding any trace of the elderly man, Sheriff Montgomery concluded that he had probably traveled to visit relatives in Richmond without informing anyone. The case was archived, and the house at the end of Blackwood Pike was closed, awaiting the owner's return. The investigation reports, though succinct, mention a detail that did not receive due attention at the time. During the inspection of the property, the deputies found all of Ezekiel Browder's clothes and personal belongings intact in the wardrobes. His jewelry box contained all the pieces cataloged in his personal inventory, including valuable items such as a gold pocket watch and a set of cufflinks that, according to witnesses, he greatly valued as having been gifts from his late wife. In the drawer of his desk, a wallet containing a considerable amount of money remained untouched. If the widower had indeed traveled of his own volition, he had left without taking any belongings or resources. However, the diary found by Prudence was never attached to the official case file. Sheriff Montgomery claimed to have returned it to the Reverend's housekeeper, who in turn claimed never to have received it back. For decades, the whereabouts of this document remained unknown until, in 1961, during the renovation of an old parish house in Salem, a stonemason named Jeremiah Holcomb found a wooden box embedded in a false wall. Inside the box, wrapped in black silk, was Ezekiel Browder's diary. The discovery was initially kept secret by the mason, who, being superstitious, feared that the object might be related to some unorthodox religious practice. It was only 3 months later, upon overhearing a casual conversation about the old mystery of the vanished widower, that Jeremiah decided to reveal his discovery to his employer, engineer Howard Maxwell, who in turn informed the ecclesiastical authorities. Father Augustus Lambert, responsible for the parish at that time, took possession of the document and, after reading its contents, decided to hand it over to the history department of Roanoke College. However, for reasons never officially clarified, the diary was archived in the restricted document section of the university library, where it remained inaccessible to the public for 5 more years. Father Augustus, a cultured and methodical man, educated in theology at Yale Divinity School, was not given to superstitions or unnecessary alarms. This makes even more intriguing the content of a letter he sent to the Bishop of Virginia, along with his request to transfer the diary to the university. In the letter, partially preserved in diocesan archives, he writes, "Your Excellency will understand my hesitation in deciding the appropriate destination for this document. Its content, especially in the final pages, raises questions that transcend the scope of our common theological understanding. I suggest nothing of a supernatural nature. I am, as you know, averse to such explanations, but there is in these pages a testimony to something profoundly disturbing that I believe should be studied by minds prepared for deeper psychological and historical analyses. What concerns me is not so much what is written, but the evident transformation in the person who wrote it. In 1966, Professor Archibald Mercer, during research on the social history of Roanoke County in the early 19th century, obtained permission to consult the document. What he found in the yellowed pages of Ezekiel Browder's diary disturbed him deeply, leading him to abandon his original research and dedicate himself exclusively to the study of this case. Archibald Mercer was not just a competent historian, but also a meticulous researcher with secondary training in psychology. Born in 1918 in Lynchburg, he had served briefly in the Army during World War II before dedicating himself to academic life. His specialty was documenting oral histories and analyzing personal documents such as letters and diaries to reconstruct social and psychological aspects of historical periods. When he gained access to Ezekiel Browder's diary, he was working on a broad study of social transformations in Roanoke Valley at the turn of the century. The first entries in the diary dated from March 1861, soon after Adelaide's death. They were mundane notes about the day-to-day life of a widower, lists of tasks, expense records, occasionally reflections on solitude and loss. The handwriting was firm, organized, reflecting the methodical personality that acquaintances attributed to Ezekiel Browder. An entry from April 1861 offers a glimpse into the routine and mental state of the widower at that time. April 17, 1861. Today I received a visit from Mr. Hawthorne, attorney, to address pending matters of the estate. The papers are in order, as Father always maintained them. The house, the lands in Bedford County, and the shares in the railroad company remain as solid assets, sufficient to maintain me comfortably for the rest of my days. I feel grateful for this, but would trade all this material security for a few more years with her. The nights are especially difficult. The house seems larger and emptier. Sometimes I wake thinking I have heard her voice calling me from the parlor, as she did when waiting for me to finish my evening work. The doctor recommended I take valerian drops to aid in sleep, but I hesitate. I prefer the lucidity of pain to the confusion induced by medicines. Over the following months, the entries follow a similar pattern, documenting Ezekiel Browder's gradual adaptation to his new reality as a widower. He mentions occasional visits from acquaintances, decisions about the administration of his assets, and reflections on grief. A recurring theme is his reluctance to modify any aspect of the house or dispose of his wife's belongings, as if preserving the physical environment could somehow keep her presence alive. A curious entry from September 1861 mentions for the first time the basement of the house. September 22nd, 1861. I needed to go down to the basement today to fetch some wine bottles for dinner with Judge Harrington. I had not entered there since Adelaide's death. She always insisted on being the only one to handle that particular wine cellar. Strangely, I found the small door at the back ajar, though I am certain it should have been locked. The key, which Adelaide always carried with her, was in the lock. I did not dare look at what lies beyond it. I never entered that compartment. Adelaide said it was merely a storage for old family objects, things without value, but which she did not have the heart to discard. I closed the door, removed the key, and now keep it with me. Tomorrow I shall ask Silas to check if there is any external entrance that might explain how that door came to be open. However, beginning in October 1874, the tone of the entries began to change subtly. Ezekiel started recording strange sensations, nocturnal noises he could not identify, a persistent feeling of being watched, objects that seemed to change location when he wasn't looking. October 16, 1874, again that sound like nails scratching wood coming from the walls. I asked Silas to check for possible rats, but he found no trace. Perhaps it is just the old house settling, as he suggested. But why always at midnight? Silas Jenkins was the gardener and handyman who worked for Ezekiel 3 times a week, according to county employment records. He left service at the house at the end of Blackwood Pike in November 1874, claiming to have found a better position on a farm on the outskirts of town. However, when Professor Mercer managed to locate a relative of Silas Harriet Jenkins in 1966, she told a different story. Silas never spoke about that house, nor about the old gentleman. When we asked why he had left a stable job in town to work so far away, he would only say that there were things that money didn't compensate for. On the night before leaving for the farm, I heard him tell his wife that the walls of that house had eyes and ears. We never understood what he meant by that. Harriet also revealed to Professor Mercer a disturbing detail that does not appear in any official record. Her uncle, a previously healthy and robust man, began to waste away soon after leaving employment at Ezekiel Browder's house. It was as if something consumed him from within, she described. He grew thin, lost his appetite, and at night suffered from nightmares so intense that he would scream until hoarse. Before dying, just 6 months after leaving that house, he raved about something that lived between the walls and repeated, "I should not have looked, should not have opened that door." The entries in the diary became more disturbing as November advanced. Ezekiel reported having seen a dark figure standing at the foot of his bed during the night, which disappeared when he lit the lamp. He mentioned whispering voices that seemed to come from inside the walls, speaking words he could not understand but which somehow seemed directed at him. On November 1st, 1874, he wrote, "I found that photograph again at the bottom of the bureau drawer, though I am certain I burned it 3 days ago. How is this possible? The image seems different now. His eyes seem to follow me around the room. Tomorrow I shall burn it again, and this time scatter the ashes in the garden." The photograph in question was never found, and the diary does not specify whose image it was. Considering that Ezekiel refers to the person in the photograph as him in capital letters, Professor Mercer initially assumed it to be his late wife. However, later entries cast doubt on this interpretation. On November 5th, he writes, "I did not sleep again. The sounds in the walls continue, louder now, more insistent. They no longer seem like scratches, but rhythmic knocks, as if someone or something were trying to communicate through a code. I have made the decision to check the basement tomorrow, the small door at the back, which has remained locked all these years. Perhaps there is something there that explains these phenomena. The key remains with me, kept in the jewelry box since that day in 1861. Adelaide made me promise never to open it, but she is no longer here to protect me from whatever might be on the other side. And what if what torments me is precisely there?" On November 6th, the entry is brief and disturbing. "I went down to the basement today. The key was no longer in the jewelry box, though I am certain I left it there last night. I found it in the lock of the small door as if someone had placed it there. The door was ajar. The smell that came from inside, I cannot adequately describe it. A mixture of damp earth, mold, and something else, something metallic like old blood or oxidized iron. I did not have the courage to open the door completely or enter. I locked it again and brought the key with me. Tonight I shall sleep with it under my pillow." On November 8th, Ezekiel reports a recurring dream, the same dream for the 3rd night in a row. "I am standing before that door in the basement, the one I always keep locked. In the dream I know I should not open it, but my hands move against my will. When the door opens, I see only darkness and feel an intense cold coming from inside. Then, from the depths of that darkness, I hear that voice, not Adelaide's, but the other one, the one that promised to return. 'I am fulfilling my promise,' says the voice. And then I wake, always at 3:17 in the morning, with the sensation that someone is sitting on the edge of my bed." The reference to the other voice and the promise of return is particularly intriguing, as there is no previous mention in the diary of such a promise, or who might have made it. Professor Mercer dedicated considerable time trying to discover if there might be some secret door or hidden room in the basement of the house at the end of Blackwood Pike. But when he finally obtained permission to examine the property in May 1966, he discovered that the basement had been completely cemented over during a renovation carried out in 1923. When the house was briefly occupied by a family of tobacco merchants, this family, the Montgomerys, no relation to the former sheriff, remained on the property for only 9 months, a remarkably short period considering the substantial investment they had made in renovating the house. Randolph Montgomery, patriarch of the family, was a successful merchant who had built a prosperous business in tobacco exports. In 1923, at 58 years old, he decided to acquire a residence that reflected his social status. And the old Browder house, which had remained closed for years, presented itself as an opportunity. Records of the time show that Montgomery hired architect Frederick Jameson to supervise an extensive renovation of the property, including modernizations such as electrical installation and indoor plumbing. A curious detail appears in the architect's notes, preserved in the County Public Archive. Client insisted on complete cementing of the basement after incident with the workers. I suggested keeping at least one section as a wine cellar, given the favorable climate, but Mr. Montgomery was unyielding. "I want that space permanently sealed," were his exact words. The incident mentioned is not detailed in the official notes, but Professor Mercer obtained some information through an assistant to Frederick Jameson. According to this assistant who accompanied the project, 2 workers who were removing debris from the basement discovered a small door embedded in the back wall. Curious, they forced the lock and found a narrow compartment, no larger than a closet. What they saw inside was never fully clarified, but both men abandoned the job the same day, refusing to return even when offered double pay. One of them, according to reports, moved away from the county the following week. As the end of November approached, the entries in the diary became more spaced out and fragmented. The handwriting began to show signs of deterioration, with words crossed out and stains that could be tears or spilled ink. On November 9th, there is a particularly disturbing entry. "I can no longer sleep. When I close my eyes, I feel his presence in the room. The walls are damp now, though it has not rained. The moisture forms patterns that look like watching faces. The smell. That same smell of damp earth and something else, something I recognize but cannot name. I should have burned all those objects when I had the chance. Now it is too late. Adelaide knew. She tried to warn me." An entry from November 10th contains an even more disturbing account. "Someone or something has been walking through the house during the night. I hear the footsteps above my room in the attic that has remained locked for years. The creaking of the floorboards is unmistakable. Last night I gathered the courage to go up and check. The attic door was locked as always, the key kept in the drawer of my desk. But upon placing my ear against the wood, I clearly heard breathing on the other side, heavy and irregular. Even more disturbing was that, as I moved away, the breathing stopped abruptly, as if whatever was in there knew I was listening. I returned to my room and locked the door. In the early hours, I woke to the sound of scratching at my door. It was not like an animal trying to get in, but something deliberate. 3 slow scratches, followed by 3 faster ones, then a pause, and the pattern repeated. I lay motionless in bed, without the courage to check. The scratching continued for nearly an hour, then ceased. In the morning, I examined the door. There were no visible marks on the wood. On November 9th, Ezekiel makes a cryptic reference to an event from the past. "I have thought much about that night, the last when Adelaide seemed truly lucid, before the illness consumed her completely. She called me to the study late at night and gave me the key to that door in the basement, making me swear never to open it. 'What we did was wrong, Ezekiel,' she said. 'I should not have brought that thing into our home. I should not have made that agreement. I never knew what agreement she referred to. Adelaide always handled her private affairs separately. But I remember that in 1858, after returning from a trip to New Orleans, she changed. She became more reserved, spent hours alone in the basement, and occasionally I heard her conversing down there, though I never saw anyone enter or leave. It was after this trip that the compartment at the back of the basement was constructed, officially to store important documents. Now I wonder, what is really kept in there? The last regular entry is dated November 10th, 1874. I found marks on the basement floor today, as if something heavy had been dragged toward that door. I did not enter there. I cannot. But I know I must face him eventually. The voices are louder now, almost clear enough to understand what they say. I think they are calling my name, or perhaps it is just the wind. Tomorrow I will go to the church to speak with Reverend Winthrop. Perhaps he can help. There is no record that Ezekiel Browder actually sought out Reverend Jeremiah Winthrop. According to the parish visitation book preserved in the diocesan archives, his last confession occurred on October 26, 1874. However, there exists an intriguing document in the Reverend's personal archives, a handwritten note on high-quality paper, signed by Ezekiel Browder, and dated November 11, 1874. Reverend Winthrop, I beg forgiveness for not attending our meeting scheduled for today. Unforeseen circumstances require my presence at home. The matter about which I intended to consult you has become more urgent than I imagined. I request your prayers, as I fear I am facing something that transcends my understanding and, perhaps, the very doctrine of the Church. If we do not see each other again in this world, know that I depart at peace with my conscience, though not necessarily at peace with what dwells between these walls. May God protect you, Ezekiel Browder. Reverend Winthrop never mentioned this note publicly, and it was only discovered after his death in 1922 among his personal documents. After the entry of November 10th, there is a gap of almost a month without annotations. Then on November 11th, the day before his absence was first noticed, there is a final entry. The handwriting is almost unrecognizable, tremulous, and hurried, as if written by someone on the verge of collapse. It is here, in the house, with me, not Adelaide, never was. The basement door is open now. It was not I who opened it. The sounds it makes as it moves through the walls. I can no longer stay. But where to go when he is everywhere? The photographs, all of them, even those I burned, have returned. The faces in the photos have changed. They all have his eyes now. I must end this. There is only one way. This is the last clearly legible entry in the diary. In the final pages, there are only incoherent scribbles and what appear to be frustrated attempts to draw something, perhaps a face or a symbol. On the last page, there is a single phrase, written with a surprisingly clear and firm handwriting, so different from the previous text that it raised questions about whether it had been written by the same person. I finally understood what he wanted from the beginning. Professor Archibald Mercer spent the following years trying to construct a clearer chronology of events and determine what really happened to Ezekiel Browder. In his research notebooks found after his death in 1968, he raises several hypotheses, from supernatural explanations, which he himself dismissed as the product of a fevered imagination of a lonely elderly man, to more mundane possibilities, an intruder who tormented the widower, some distant relative with interest in his inheritance, or even a case of progressive mental deterioration that culminated in escape or suicide. One of the aspects that most intrigued the professor was the coincidence between the recurring time in Ezekiel Browder's dreams, 3:17, and the fact that all the clocks in the house were found stopped at that same time. This coincidence suggested that something significant had occurred at that specific moment, possibly on the night before his disappearance. Another disturbing element that Mercer highlighted in his notes was the final phrase of the diary. The handwriting of that last entry, so different from the rest, raised questions about its authenticity. Would it be possible that another person had written that line? And if so, who? And what would be the meaning of that understanding mentioned? One of the most intriguing aspects that Mercer discovered during his investigation were the death records of Adelaide Browder. According to the official document, she died of natural causes on February 17, 1861. However, upon examining the archives of the old Roanoke Memorial Hospital, the professor found a medical report that offered additional details. Adelaide had suffered from a mysterious ailment that caused severe hallucinations in the weeks before her death. The doctor responsible, Dr. Ambrose Whitfield, described that the patient frequently spoke about something that lived inside the walls and insisted that she had made an agreement that could not be fulfilled. This medical report, dated February 15, 1861, includes additional observations that Mercer considered particularly relevant. The patient alternates between periods of lucidity and episodes of extreme agitation. During moments of mental clarity, she expresses a rational and consistent fear related to an agreement she claims to have made during her trip to New Orleans in 1858. Although reluctant to provide specific details, she mentioned having acquired an ancient object from a merchant in the French Quarter, an object that she now keeps stored in a special compartment in her residence. More concerning is her insistence that this object is not inanimate. The patient, Adelaide Browder, a woman of education and respectable social position, does not seem prone to superstitions. Yet, she describes with disturbing conviction that the object changed after being brought to her home and now communicates with her through the walls. When asked about the nature of these communications, the patient becomes extremely agitated, refusing to elaborate. In the last 48 hours, her physical state has deteriorated significantly. She presents permanently dilated pupils, even under intense light, abnormally low body temperature, and a peculiar odor emanating from the skin that does not correspond to any pathological condition known to this physician. There are also inexplicable marks on the forearms and neck, similar to bruises, but with a regular pattern that suggests more a deliberate contact than accidental injuries. As a physician, I must record only observable facts, but I confess that this case defies my scientific understanding. If I were a man of lesser education, I might suggest that Mrs. Browder is under some sort of malevolent influence. As I am not, I limit myself to documenting her condition and administering the prescribed sedatives to alleviate her suffering, though I fear the outcome is inevitably fatal. Adelaide Browder died 2 days after the drafting of this report. The death certificate signed by the same Dr. Ambrose Whitfield lists cardiac arrest as the cause of death, omitting all the disturbing details documented in the hospital report. During his research, Professor Mercer also interviewed several elderly residents of the area, including Florence Whitaker, who in 1874 was a young woman of 20 who lived 3 houses down from the Browder residence. According to Florence's testimony, recorded in 1966, in those days, no one spoke openly about the Browder house, but everyone knew there was something strange there. My mother forbade me from passing in front of that house alone. On full moon nights, sometimes we would hear sounds coming from there. Not screams nor voices exactly, but a kind of low lament, like someone humming a sad melody. On the morning they discovered he had disappeared, I was returning from the bakery and saw something I never told the authorities. I saw a man leaving the house very early, before the sun had even risen. He wore a hat that covered his face and carried something in his arms, wrapped in a dark cloth. At the time I thought it might be a doctor, perhaps, who had been called during the night. But now, thinking about it, why would a doctor leave carrying something like that instead of simply doing his work and leaving? This testimony raises disturbing questions about the events of that morning. Who was the man seen by Florence? What was he carrying? And why did this information never reach the official authorities? In a note following the interview with Florence, Professor Mercer writes, "The description of the man seen by F.W. curiously corresponds to reports of a stranger who was occasionally seen visiting Adelaide Browder in the months preceding her death. According to Prudence Miller, this visitor never identified himself, always arrived after sunset, and Adelaide insisted on receiving him alone in the study or the basement. The housekeeper described him as a thin man, very pale, of considerable height, always dressed in dark clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. Coincidence? Or would it be possible that the same individual was somehow connected both to Adelaide's death and her husband's disappearance 11 years later? The house at the end of Blackwood Pike remained closed for many years after Ezekiel Browder's disappearance. In 1923, it was acquired by tobacco merchant Randolph Montgomery, who carried out extensive renovations before moving in with his family. Curiously, the Montgomerys occupied the property for only 9 months before moving suddenly, selling the house for a value well below market price. When questioned about the reasons for the move, Randolph Montgomery reportedly said only that the house was not suitable for a family with peace of mind. During the interview he granted to Professor Mercer in 1966, Randolph Montgomery, then 101 years old and residing in Charlottesville, showed extreme reluctance to discuss his brief occupation of the house at the end of Blackwood Pike. Only after much insistence did he agree to provide some details, with the express condition that the conversation not be recorded. According to Mercer's notes, Montgomery reported that in the first weeks after the move, the family was enthusiastic about the new residence. The renovation had been extensive, modernizing the house without compromising its historical character. However, after approximately 1 month, inexplicable events began to occur. At first it was small things, Montgomery supposedly said, objects that disappeared and reappeared in different places, strange sounds in the walls, like scratches or rhythmic knocking. My wife complained of a persistent odor in the master bedroom, a smell of damp earth and something metallic that no cleaning could eliminate. We replaced the floorboards, checked the plumbing, even removed part of the wall covering, but the smell always returned. The incident that finally motivated the move, according to Montgomery, occurred on a night in July 1923. His wife woke up screaming, claiming to have seen a dark figure standing at the foot of the bed. When Montgomery turned on the light, there was no one there. However, on the dresser, they found an object that did not belong to them, a small carved wooden box containing a single photograph. It was a photograph of an elderly man seated in a chair, said Montgomery. Behind him there was something like a shadow, but with a vaguely human form. Most disturbing were the man's eyes. They were completely black, like holes in the image. I recognized him immediately as the former owner, Ezekiel Browder, whose portrait I had seen in the county records office when we signed the purchase papers. On the back of the photograph was a phrase written, "He lives in the walls and wants company." The next morning, Montgomery contracted workers to completely cement the basement, especially the hidden compartment that had been discovered during the renovation. A week later, the family left the house, never returning even to retrieve many of the personal belongings they left behind. In the years that followed, the property passed through several owners, none staying for more than 2 years. In 1952, after remaining empty for nearly a decade, it was finally demolished to make way for a small commercial building, which initially housed a pharmacy and later a fabric store. During the demolition, as reported in the Roanoke Times of July 17, 1952, the workers made a macabre discovery. Upon removing the cemented floor of the basement, they found a small wooden door sealed with what appeared to be black wax. The construction foreman, Gideon Parker, decided to open the door, revealing a small compartment, no larger than a closet. Inside, there were only 3 items: an antique matchbox, a broken perfume bottle, and a faded photograph. The news report does not offer details about the content of the photograph, mentioning only that it was turned over to the authorities. However, there is no record of this photograph in the police archives of the time. The only clue to its possible content comes from an interview granted by Gideon Parker himself to Professor Mercer in 1967. I will never forget that image as long as I live. It was a photograph of an elderly man, probably that Mr. Browder, seated in a chair. Behind him there was an obscure figure, like a shadow with human form. Most disturbing were the gentleman's eyes in the photo. They were completely black, as if someone had covered them with ink, and there was a message written on the back of the photograph. But it was so faded that I could distinguish only a few words: fulfilled, promise, inside, walls. Parker also revealed a detail that he omitted from the press at the time. Beside the photograph, they found what appeared to be a small carved bone box, similar to an ancient reliquary. The box was empty, except for a thin layer of dark powder at the bottom. When asked what happened to this object, Parker confessed to having been disturbed by the discovery and decided to burn it that same night, along with the matchbox. The photograph, being potentially relevant to the old disappearance case, was the only item he turned over to the authorities. Professor Archibald Mercer passed away in January 1968 before concluding his research on the case of Ezekiel Browder. His notes and collected materials were donated to the university library, but inexplicably, a large part of this collection disappeared during a reorganization of the archive in 1968, leaving only a few field notebooks and correspondence. The inexplicable loss of these documents, ironically similar to the disappearance of Ezekiel Browder's original diary from police records, was attributed to an administrative error by the library management. However, Margaret Holloway, the professor's assistant who helped him catalog the material before the donation, expressed doubts about this explanation. We meticulously organized the entire collection related to the case. There were more than 12 notebooks of annotations, photographs of the house before demolition, copies of official documents, transcriptions of interviews, everything cataloged in 3 archive boxes with clear labels. The professor was extremely methodical. It is simply impossible that all this material was lost through a common bureaucratic error. In one of these remaining notebooks, dated August 1967, Mercer records a disturbing personal experience. After months investigating the case, he began to suffer from insomnia and hear strange sounds in his own home, scratches in the walls, footsteps in the hallway when he was alone, the creaking of a rocking chair in his study, although he did not own such furniture. In his last known notation about the case, he writes, "I dreamed of him last night." Ezekiel Browder was standing in the basement of the house at the end of Blackwood Pike before that door. He looked directly at me and said, "You two made a promise, Professor." When I woke, I found a matchbox identical to the one described in the demolition report on my desk. I do not know how it got there. My house was locked. Tomorrow I will end this research. There are questions that should not be answered, mysteries that should remain buried. Ezekiel Browder understood this too late. I still have time. Professor Mercer formally abandoned his research on the case of Ezekiel Browder soon after this incident, returning to his previous studies on the social history of Roanoke County. He rarely mentioned the subject, and when questioned, would say only that he had lost interest in the story. A curious detail documented by his assistant Margaret is that the professor insisted on burning all his notebooks related to the case that were still in his personal possession. The assistant also reported a change in his behavior after abandoning the research. He began to avoid working after nightfall, installed additional lighting in his home, and developed an almost phobic aversion to enclosed spaces, such as basements and attics. The truth about what happened to Ezekiel Browder in November 1874 remains a mystery. His body was never found. No concrete evidence of crime was established. The official records continue to list his case as disappearance. In 1962, a journalist from the Roanoke Times named Walter Hayes attempted to reopen the investigation, fascinated by the urban legend that had formed around the widower's house, as it was locally known. He managed to locate and interview Prudence Miller, the Reverend's housekeeper, who had found the empty house in 1874. Prudence, then 86 years old, showed signs of senile dementia, but in moments of lucidity told Hayes something she had never mentioned officially. "When I entered that house, I immediately felt that something was wrong. It wasn't just the silence or the absence of the gentleman. It was as if the house were breathing. The walls seemed to pulse subtly, like a heart beating very slowly, and there was a smell, not of decomposition or illness, but of freshly dug earth and candle wax. The strangest thing was what I found in his room. The bed was perfectly made, as if no one had slept in it. On the pillow there was a single object, an old key, large, probably to the basement, and beside the key, almost imperceptible against the white of the sheet, small stains of a dark liquid that I preferred to believe was ink. Prudence also revealed to the journalist a detail she had omitted from the police in 1874, for fear of being considered superstitious or mentally unstable. When I went down to the basement to check if Mr. Browder might be there, I noticed that the small door at the back, the one he always kept locked, was ajar. The strong smell of damp earth came from there. I approached with trepidation, but something impelled me to look. The compartment beyond the door was small, like a closet built into the wall, but seemed to extend deeper than the structure of the house would allow. The inner walls were of compacted earth, not masonry like the rest of the basement. In the center, there was an object that I couldn't immediately identify. It looked like a small carved box, made of some material that was neither wood nor metal. Beside it, a photograph turned face down. I didn't touch anything. Something in that place caused me an instinctive dread, something I cannot explain. I closed the door, ran up the stairs, and never returned to that house. Walter Hayes's article about the case was published in a Sunday edition of the Roanoke Times in July 1962, but did not generate the interest he had hoped for. The story had become just another urban legend among so many others that populated the city's imagination. Hayes himself soon moved on to other subjects, and the mystery of Ezekiel Browder was once again relegated to oblivion. A disturbing coincidence, not publicly recorded, was the sudden death of Walter Hayes just 3 months after the publication of his article. According to the death certificate, he died in his sleep, victim of a heart attack at 38 years of age. A colleague from the newspaper, however, confided to Professor Mercer that in the weeks preceding his death, Hayes had become increasingly paranoid, claiming to hear strange sounds in his apartment and feeling constantly observed. He also mentioned having found, without explanation, an old matchbox on his desk, similar to the one described in the demolition report of the house. Today, the location where the house at the end of Blackwood Pike once stood houses a small department store. The oldest employees sometimes comment on strange nocturnal occurrences, merchandise that changes place, sounds of footsteps on the upper floor when the establishment is empty, and occasionally the persistent aroma of old cologne that seems to emanate from the walls. The current manager, Rebecca Chapman, who has worked at the location since 1960, reports that these occurrences intensify at certain times of the year, particularly in November, the month of Ezekiel Browder's disappearance. It's something that everyone who works here for any length of time eventually notices. It's not frightening, it's more uncomfortable, as if you were never really alone in the building, even when you clearly are. Some employees refuse to close the store alone, especially on Mondays. I don't know why specifically on Mondays, but that's when the strange things seem to happen most frequently. The air becomes heavier, like before a storm, and that smell of old cologne appears, a sweet aroma, but with an underlying note of damp earth. And sometimes, just for an instant, You have the sensation of seeing someone out of the corner of your eye, usually near the stairs that once led to the basement. When you turn, there's no one there. In 1963, during renovation of the store's floor, workers found, embedded in the concrete, a small silver medallion with the inscription EB 1874. The object was donated to the County Historical Museum, where it remains on display, a silent reminder that some secrets resist the passage of time. Curiously, the museum employee responsible for cataloging the piece, Samuel Wheeler, reported a strange incident related to the medallion. According to him, on the first night after the item was placed on display, the museum's security cameras recorded an inexplicable failure, precisely at 3:17 in the morning, lasting exactly 7 minutes. When the system resumed functioning, the medallion had moved within the display case, rotating 180 degrees. Technicians examined the system and found no explanation for the failure. What really happened to Ezekiel Browder in that house at the end of Blackwood Pike? Was he the victim of a common crime committed by someone interested in his fortune? Did he succumb to madness and isolation, fleeing or taking his own life? Or is there something darker in this story, something that official records and rational explanations cannot fully capture? Perhaps the answer lies in the last legible words of his diary. I finally understood what he wanted from the beginning. What would that late understanding be? And who or what was he? Professor Mercer, in his final notes on the case, offers an intriguing perspective. After months of investigation, I find myself contemplating possibilities that my academic training hesitates to accept. The patterns are undeniable. The black eyes in the photographs, the persistent smell of damp earth and metal, the sounds in the walls, the specific time. 3:17 that appears repeatedly, the sensation of being observed, the progressive mental deterioration of people who delve into the mystery, and, most disturbing, the obscure figure consistently described by witnesses separated by decades. There is an element in this case that resists conventional explanations, something that seems to persist beyond the demolition of the house, beyond the death of the original witnesses, beyond even time itself, like an echo that refuses to dissipate or a presence that has found a way to transcend the physical limits that should contain it. I dare not fully articulate what I suspect, but the last phrase in Ezekiel Browder's diary, "I finally understood what he wanted from the beginning," continues to resonate. What did he comprehend? And why did that comprehension coincide with his disappearance? There exists an old concept in Southern folklore, rarely discussed openly, called the soul merchant. A being that is not exactly human, that makes agreements, grants wishes, but eventually returns to collect a payment much more valuable than the beneficiary initially perceives. Would it be possible that Adelaide Browder, during her mysterious trip to New Orleans, encountered something of this nature? Something that she brought home, confining it in that sealed compartment in the basement, only to discover too late that some entities cannot be truly contained? Pure speculation, naturally. The most probable explanation remains being a conventional crime or a tragic case of mental instability. However, I cannot ignore the chill I feel when rereading the accounts, nor the persistent sensation that, in investigating this mystery, I have attracted some kind of unwanted attention. Some stories have no definitive conclusion, only echoes that resonate through the decades, reminding us that not all mysteries were meant to be unraveled. The case of Ezekiel Browder is one of those echoes, a whisper from the past that, even after more than a century, still makes us look with suspicion at old walls and dark basements, wondering what might be hidden beyond appearances. And if by chance you find yourself walking the historic streets of Roanoke Valley at dusk and feel a sudden chill as if being watched, if you notice a vague aroma of old cologne in the air, perhaps it is just coincidence, or perhaps it is a reminder that some presences never truly depart, Some promises once made are impossible to break. There is an old saying in Virginia, "Not all stories end when a person dies." In the case of Ezekiel Browder, it seems the story only began with his disappearance, and perhaps, in some sense we do not fully comprehend, it still continues today. And you, who now know this story, have you checked the walls of your house today? Have you paid attention to the sounds that come from them when all is silent? And if by chance you wake at 3:17 in the morning, perhaps it would be prudent to avoid looking at the dark corners of your room. Some things, once seen, cannot be forgotten. Some stories, once known, become part of us. As the ancients said, knowledge is power, but some knowledge is also a burden, and some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again.